2.5 years to this quarterly webinar series. And our topic for today, we will begin, it's 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. India time, which is, various times around the world. The future of the workforce and employment in India. And this is about one of what I would call four broadly overlapping debates. We had the COVID crunch, and then we had rapid bounce back, and what is usually held to be the fastest growing large economy post COVID. And what is happening in all this to the workforce and to the employment situation in India? There's been wide debate, which is part of what I would see, from my perspective, as part of four overlapping debates. One is the debate on GDP growth, the debate on employment and workforce, the debate on poverty, and the debate on inequality. These are four overlapping debates. And the topic of employment and workforce overlaps all of these. Plus, they are all underlaid or overlaid by, given the absence of a 2021 census, the decennial census, what are the sources, the debate on the appropriate sources and on the reliability of figures, statistics. And I won't spend more time on that. And there's also much talk of India's demographic dividend, which will last another 15 or 20 years. Whereas in the existing developed world, both in the West and in East Asia, and including China, the demographic dividend is basically over, and you are moving towards already reached zero population growth, declining populations, declining workforces, especially prime age workforces. So what does all this mean for India's prospects, and especially workforce and employment, given that India still has a very large informal economy? How do you measure all that? So here today we will debate this, we'll discuss this, and we have two presentations by two leading experts in this whole area, who are distinguished economists and who are distinguished also commentators on policy issues. And let me just briefly introduce them before handing the floor to them. Our first speaker will be Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who is currently a visiting professor in the Center for Development Studies at the University of Bath in the UK, and also with the IZA Institute in Bonn, Germany. And before that, he was a professor of economics in the Center for Labor, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he was for a long time in the United Nations earlier on, and returned to India. And then he was with the Planning Commission and participating directly in policy. And he was also, he has published extensively and has been translated extensively too. And there's so much to his bio that we don't have enough time to go into all of that. So he's one of the most distinguished policy experts and commentators in this field. And after him, we will have Professor Arun Kumar, who also is one of the most distinguished economists and commentators. He retired as the Sukumar Chakravarti Chair Professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he chaired the Commission on Unemployment set up by the civil society groups. And he was also the president and acting president, the vice president and acting president of the Indian Academy of Social Sciences. And he has a master's in physics from Princeton and a PhD from JNU. And he is, again, has written extensively on the black economy in India, the economic policy, on matters pertaining to higher education, and a whole range of other things. So we have two of the most distinguished people who have worked in and commented on the topic of the day. So what we'll do is we'll have half an hour presentation each, and then we have roughly about half an hour for Q&A before we wind up at about 8 p.m. India time. And please send in your questions on the chat box so that we economize on time rather than live questioning. That's the format we follow. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Professor Santosh Mehrotra.
Thank you very much indeed in any case. So you can see that I put this the word fast, growing fast. This is the impression that the whole global community seems to have, that India is now the fastest growing large economy in the world, and which, if you are to believe government numbers, it clearly does appear to be so. And I should add that, of course, India has been the second fastest growing large economy in the world for the last 20 years. In any case, it's just that in the last few years, China's growth rate has slowed, so we've become the fastest growing large economy. So there's so much about that phrase. I'm going to come back to that, and really focus on the point that, you know, India is not generating jobs fast enough. India grew at 7.8% per annum over 2004 to 14. But in the last 10 years, it has actually grown at only 5.8% per annum. And yet, but at 5.8% per annum, it has become the fastest growing large economy in the world in the last 2 or 3 years, but only for the last 2 or 3 years, because the world slowed post-COVID and we recovered very fast. So our fast recovery was primarily on account of the fact that our contraction was twice as large in the first year of COVID as the global economy. So there was a base effect there. Point is, none of the international agencies, the World Bank, IMF, OECD, none of them project India's growth rate will be higher than 6.5% per annum to 2030 for the rest of this decade. And finally, really, there are serious question marks about the claimed fast GDP growth rate of India. And I won't go into too much detail, and this is a subject that it may well be that Arun comes back to, because both Arun and I have been writing about this, but I need just a minute to explain the fact that in the last 8 years, the unorganized sector of our economy, which accounts for about 85% of our economy, only 15% of our enterprises, and only about 10% of our workers are in the formal sector. The unorganized sector of our economy suffered 3 massive policy-induced shocks. The first one was in 2016, the demonetization of 86% of our currency, followed 6 months later by a poorly designed and a badly implemented goods and services tax, which was a good thing in any case, but it should have been done. But the fact of the matter is that it reduced. It had a massive adverse impact on the unorganized sector. Reasons, I don't have enough time to talk about them. The fact of the matter is that these two led to a slowing of the growth rate all the way till COVID, and of course, then the policy-induced shocks of COVID itself were extremely adverse for the unorganized sector. COVID was badly managed on the health side, and the fiscal and the monetary policy stimuli were also not terribly effective. So our economy contracted twice as much as the global economy. The result of all this was unorganized sector fell. Now, the way that this has impacted, the calculation or the estimation of growth is as follows. You see, historically, in an informal economy, the way estimates are made for in a highly informalized economy for the unorganized sector of the economy is as follows: that the Central Statistical Organization is unable to collect enough information about enterprises in the unorganized sector, in any particular sector, let's say textiles. So what the CSO does is, in fact, use the gross value added growth rates of the organized segment of, let's say, the textile sector, and projects it onto the unorganized sector. Now, this was all right until 2016, because there was a sort of continuity in this methodology. So there were no hiccups or ups and downs on account of that. However, as I've just been explaining to you, in the last 8 years, the unorganized sector suffered massive shocks, policy-induced shocks. The result was the growth rate is actually not as great as is now being claimed to be. Be that as it may, the more important point is, I think, something that Professor Sridharan actually already hinted at, which is that India is still a low middle income country, and Yet at the same time, wealth and income inequality in India now, which has been growing for the last 40 years, has reached a level which is comparable to that found in Brazil and South Africa, which are among the most unequal countries in the world. And I think this is reasonably well established by good work done by Piketty, Chancellor, etc., by the World Inequality Lab. And India, they in fact say, is now more unequal than 100 years ago in the British Raj. Okay, all this is, in a sense, I would have been showing you what has happened to wealth and income inequality, and just believe what I would have loved to show you the graphs, but anyway, never mind that. The point is, why is there a job slowdown? There are, of course, supply side issues, but demand is also a very important constraint on sustained growth. In the period from 2004 to 14, both supply and demand side factors were working to actually generate growth. And most of the growth slowdown has been post-2016 for the reasons I explained. Now, these are actually, I would argue, now deep enough to be structural, as I will attempt to sort of briefly argue, though I'm, very cognizant of the time. Unfortunately, to summarize, because I have only 30 minutes, I have to summarize. I need to, talk about the job situation in the absence of slides. I'll have to move really fast here. The growth is largely being driven by consumption, and the consumption itself has tended to dip primarily because jobs are not growing. The gross fixed capital formation, the average over the period 2004 to 14 had been 32 to 38% of GDP. It was unprecedented, which is why India was growing at 7.8% per annum over that 10-year period. That investment to GDP ratio has actually fallen to 26 to 32%, which is one of the main reasons why growth rate has fallen. I could talk about other things, but I don't think I have the time to do that. I'm going to move on to say that, two major developments have happened in the economy over the last 10 years or so, which most, non-Indian observers are perhaps not familiar enough with. The first is that, manufacturing as a proportion of GDP, which had been consistent and in the range of 16 or 17% for about 25 years after the economic reforms began in 1991, all the way until 2015, on account of the policy-induced shocks, manufacturing contribution to GVA actually fell from 17% to 16 to 15 to 14 to 13. And it has only just recently begun to climb back up, but we are still nowhere close to the 17% of GDP. So what we are seeing effectively is a reversal of the process of structural change in a way that was underway. The second dimension of this structural change is the following, and that is even more deeply damaging and problematic for future growth and for the process of structural transformation. We all know that, from Lewis and Kuznets, that what we want to see happen in all developing economies is the process of structural change where the share of industry and services grows at the expense of agriculture in respect of both output and employment. Now we know what has happened as far as output is concerned. Let me tell you what has happened to agriculture's share in total employment. Agriculture's share in total employment was systematically falling all the way till about 2018, especially when it was falling over the period of fast growth from 2004 to 14. Now, the absolute number of workers in agriculture began to fall for the first time in India's history only from 2004 onwards. The share of workers in agriculture had been rising all the way for about 55 years after planned development began till 2004-5. It's only after the very rapid growth began and the economy grew faster and India started to generate 7.5 million new non-farm jobs per annum, post 2004, that workers began to be pulled out from agriculture in such large numbers that the absolute number of workers in agriculture fell, which tightened the labor market and led to a rise in real wages, which is extremely important reason for why, poverty actually fell. For the first time in the history of India, in absolute terms, the number of people below the a stable poverty line actually fell. The incidence of poverty was falling always for the preceding 40 years, but for the first time after 2004, the absolute number of workers in agriculture fell, and as a result of the absolute number of workers who were below the poverty line also fell. Now, what has happened in the last 4 years? A very shocking development has occurred, because the absolute number of workers in agriculture in 2019 stood at 200 million. I would have shown you these graphs and they would have sort of jumped out at you, but unfortunately I can't. And believe it or not, in the last 4 years, the absolute number of workers in agriculture has risen partly on account of reverse migration and partly on account of other factors, which we can discuss later if you wish, has risen by a whopping 80 million. This is an unprecedented development in the history of the world, I would argue, that in 4 years, 80 million workers get added to agriculture. Our total number of workers in agriculture has risen from 200 million to 280 million. I couldn't make a bigger, stronger case for the argument that there has been a reversal of the process of structural change that was going on until at least 5 or 6 years ago, and which had really gained pace after 2004. So on the one hand, the contribution of GVA falling to manufacturing and absolute number of workers in manufacturing dropping. This had never happened in our history. The absolute number of workers in manufacturing dropping, and simultaneously the absolute number of workers in agriculture increasing. Now, why does all this become so important? I'm staring at a graph which I think all of you would have loved to see. It's really absolutely critical for policymakers in our country and academics in India and across the globe that need to understand that India, unlike the belief of many policymakers and the intelligentsia in this country, is no more a young country. It's no more a very young population. Half of our workforce is already at the age of 45 or over. I repeat, half of our workforce is over the age of 45 or above. And our dividend is running out in 15 years flat by 2040. Our dividend has been around since the early 1980s. And the absolute number of those in working age will begin to drop from 2041. That's what my graph shows. We're already seeing a decline in the absolute number of workers, a number of youth in the age group 15 to 29. Given this, we are facing the possible prospect of becoming old without becoming rich at possibly a much lower level of per capita income than China. You know that this is the phrase that the Chinese have been using ever since their dividend ended about 10 years ago. But, this is with our growth rate stuck at 6.5%, we are just not going to make it. We'll become an aging society with 91% of our workforce still informal. The health expenditure to GDP in our country still remains stuck at 1.3% of GDP, which is way below what the requirements are. And these health costs are only going to rise with an aging society. Anyway, I'm going to move on with the objective of pointing out to you, because I'm sort of on my ninth slide. I have a total of about 22. I'm going to move faster. You see, we have 4 demographic groups for which we have to provide jobs. And each of these groups is a looming jobs crisis. Now, there is a flow of the youth, 15 to 29-year-olds. 6 million or so are entering the labor force each year, each of them much better educated each year. We graduate about 8.5 million graduates in the Bachelor of Commerce, BSc, management, etc., etc. 1.5 million engineers graduate each year. That means that's a total of 10 million young people graduating each year, of which a significant share, of course, is girls. Girls, as you probably know, has a very low share, has an extremely low LFPR in our country. Labor force participation rates in India of women are actually among the lowest in the world, comparable to that found in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, etc. But please note that girls have gotten much better educated over the last 15 to 20 years. They don't want to marry, as surveys are saying, and the LFPR is not rising, at least in a good way. We can talk about what has happened in recent years. There are government claims which are made in this regard, which I can come back to if you're interested. This is the first group for whom jobs have to be provided, the 6 million new young entrants into the labor force. Then there is the stock of the farm landless and small and marginal farmers. As I was saying to you earlier, the numbers in agriculture was already excessive at 200 million in 2019, and that has shot up, thanks to bad policy, to 280 million. In a best case scenario, as our workforce continues to rise from its current 610 million to about 700 million in 10 years or so, if we need to reduce the absolute number of workers down to 200 million, which would take our agriculture share in total employment down to about 30% or less. That's the second group for whom jobs have to be found, particularly in construction. The third group, of course, consists of the stock of unemployed. The number of unemployed was 10 million in 2012. That number had already tripled by 2019, thanks to this, economic slowdown and the pattern of growth resulting in fewer non-farm jobs being created. So that number had tripled to 30 million. And that number is nowhere less than 28 million currently. So those have to be. That's a second stock in addition to the farm workers we have to pull out. And the fourth and final group, which is a looming jobs crisis, is the following. The youth needs, not in education, employment, or training. These are the 15 to 29-year-olds. That number was about 51 million in 2012. In about 6 or 7 years, that had doubled to 100 million. That's the number of needs for whom we have to provide jobs. Now, that should give you a sense of the following, that we need to create nothing short, we estimate, in a forthcoming book that Professor Jajati Parida and I have just finished for Bloomsbury, London, which should be out later this year. It's called India Out of Work. We estimate that we need to create in the non-farm sector 10 to 11 new non-farm jobs each year. However, the government economists pretend that actually we need to create only 7 million. I don't have the time to go into their logic, but anyway, let me move on in the interest of time. I have another 10 minutes to go. I will sort of try and now quickly move to what could be, in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, to give you a sense of what could be a growth strategy for jobs. The first, of course, is that our government has to recognize that there is a jobs crisis. This government actually keeps telling us that we are generating sufficient jobs in the agriculture sector. So they think that creating jobs in the agriculture sector, which no one wants, the young certainly don't want it, and yet the young are being forced into it. The girls certainly don't want it. Their mothers used to work in agriculture. Those older women were leaving agriculture in large numbers earlier, and these girls have now gotten better educated and they all want to work in the non-farm sector. Anyway, so the first prerequisite, to my mind, is that the government has to even recognize that there is a problem. But let me, be that as it may, I'm going to work, I will speak like an economist and to speak about what could be a growth strategy for jobs. Now, given the very significant share of the workforce which is still in agriculture, there's no getting, and given also the fact that if you look at the basket of goods which constitute the consumer price index, the CPI, you'll find that 46% of that is still accounted for by food. In other words, of total consumption expenditure, 46% is being accounted for by food. It's absolutely critical that, both productivity in agriculture and incomes in agriculture need to increase. That requires much greater investment in public investment in agriculture, which has fallen off. And if we don't get an increase in both public investment as well as a rise in incomes, we will not see consumer expenditure growth in rural India, which has actually tapered off significantly. The result is savings rate to GDP ratio, which I was not able to talk about, and have actually fallen off. And people are having to take gold loans because gold is an asset that, as you know, many households own. And the households have actually are having to amortize consumption loans that they have taken by actually using gold loans, and also giving up on their gold loans because of the very sharp increase in gold demand and gold prices globally has enabled them to actually just pay off their loans by giving the gold to the banks to whom they had mortgaged the loans. So this is the kind of situation which is keeping consumption low. And there's just no alternative to actually government increasing public investment in agriculture, without which, demand is not going to pick up in the rural areas. Moving on, most important is something that I was already hinting at earlier. There was a need for India to have an explicit industrial policy. If, UNCTAD told us in 2018, that in the 10 years that had since elapsed since the global economic crisis, about 100 countries post-2008 crisis had actually adopted industrial policy. India, which desperately needed one, has not had one for the last 35 years. The 1991 economic reforms had an industrial policy statement, but that was a sort of very implicit policy, which founded very much on neoliberal principles. But there was no explicit industrial policy, quite unlike the East Asians, quite unlike China, of course. On the contrary, what we saw happening over that period was a certain degree of deindustrialization happening, partly accounted for by the lack of a manufacturing strategy. Several things happened. Economic reforms began, and we rightly reduced tariffs from 150% in 1990 to up to 40% in 1998 and to 10% in 2002. But I would argue that there were three problems with that. Firstly, the speed was too fast, and the rates fell below the WTO upper bound rates, which affected small and large manufacturers adversely. This is problem one. Problem two was the sequence. Those of you who recall what our industrial policy looked like from the 1950s onwards would recall that, that India had a strategy of reserving products for small-scale industries to be only produced by small-scale industries, and medium and large firms could not enter. As product reservation rose in numbers from 0 products to 836 products by the year 1990, unfortunately, the de-reservation, which should have happened to enable domestic competition, did not really take off until after 2005. And 15 years after the economic reforms, the de-reservation had not really taken off. In 2005, we still had 500 products reserved for a small-scale industry. Now, without ending reservation, what we had permitted was international competition first. instead of allowing, our small-scale firms to actually get prepared for international competition by enabling domestic competition for slightly larger firms. So the sequence was wrong. Thirdly, unfortunately, and I won't have time to speak about this much because I'm in the last 5 minutes of my time, is this how the structure of tariffs has emerged. Unfortunately, India has allowed finished consumer product tariffs to be reduced. So imports of such products have flooded in, but tariffs on raw materials and intermediate inputs for domestic, which could be used for domestic manufacture, were higher. So an inverted duty structure emerged, which has reduced the effective rate of protection. So we've been flooded by Chinese and other East Asian, imported finished products. Given this, one can strongly argue that, we've really not had an industrial policy, and we need an industrial policy which is aligned to trade policy in order to reverse the aborted structural transformation. I'm going to move on. Secondly, what we need is special packages for 5 labor-intensive industries, which account for about 50% of all manufacturing jobs in India. What are those? Apparel and garments, textiles, food processing, wood manufacturers and furniture, and leather and footwear. These have considerable potential for both meeting growing domestic demand as well as for exports. These were sectors which were generating rapid growth between 2004 and 2012 that I was talking about earlier, which was part of the reason why overall growth was high, and they were generating jobs, raising consumption expenditure on simple manufactures. That's what this country needs. And, the fact that our inequality has grown even more and rural consumption is compressed means that, demand for these simple manufactured products has not grown, so that manufacturing jobs in these sectors in particular have fallen. So they particularly need special packages for these labor-intensive industries. Moving on, the third, I just have, 4 or 5 points to make, and I hope to finish in the next 2 or 3 minutes, Dr. Sridharan. There is also a horizontal dimension of industrial policy that we need. What is that? India has, believe it or not, 5,500 clusters across the country. I don't have to tell this audience that, cluster development was the strategy used by late industrializers like Italy and China. And India really needs to focus its attention on cluster development to support the 5,500 clusters, to support the MSMEs, especially those MSMEs which have production linkages with larger units, which is an established strategy of, late industrializers. Let me move on to a fourth point. Most mid-sized towns in our country have poor infrastructure, especially the towns where these 5,500 manufacturing clusters are located. They have very poor infrastructure. So we need to provide much better infrastructure. We have the resources to do it, but that's not where, unfortunately, the infrastructure in capex of the government has been focused. What we are building is massive airports, highways, shining railway stations, and stuff like that, rather than focusing on these kinds of activities. Fifth, we clearly need, an education and a vocational education strategy which is designed to underpin industrial policy, which would particularly focus on girls, because girls have gotten much better educated. They are looking for jobs, and a focus on human resources that India's never seen, especially not on TVET, would enable manufacturing to actually thrive in these clusters. And finally, 2 more points, and I'll finish in the next 1 minute. 2 more components of India's what could be a manufacturing strategy for India. One is focusing on recreating a design capacity within our enterprises, and then an industrial policy needs an R&D institutional system for R&D on a national scale, a national innovation system that I don't think we've enabled in our country. Design labs can contribute to create digital ecosystems. Design labs work to design quality products, carry out digitization, connect electronic systems, innovate for automation, all of which are needed if India is to adapt and develop Industry 4.0 tech. And finally, R&D. We're still spending only 0.64% of GDP on R&D as a country. And unfortunately, 70% of that is done by the government, which is the exact opposite of what happens across the globe. Only 30% is spent by our corporates. We know that the productivity of private R&D is much greater than that of public R&D. And there are many other issues with the R&D system, which I don't have the time to talk about. But let me close with that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehrotra, for a very detailed presentation. And it came, even without the slides, it came across very clearly, all the facts and figures and trends that you outlined. Now, without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Professor Arun Kumar, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussion after that. So, Professor Arun Kumar, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sridharan. I think I'll not try my slides, because if the situation is what has been, they'll probably not get through. So the title of the paper that I'm presenting is Challenge of Employment Generation in India. And this is based on basically, my work in the last 35, 40 years, and especially the report that we produced in 2022, October, looking at the challenges of employment generation in India. Now, the title of the talk that was given was, can you see? Hello? Hello?
Yeah. Hello.
There was some message that came, so I thought maybe it wasn't. So the title gives future, in the title. Now, it could apply to workforce, but it could also apply to employment. So I think we need to look at what the current situation of employment is to understand what the future of a workforce and employment will be in the Indian context. And what I want to do is I want to present the macro aspect, because employment is, as Sridharan had pointed out in the beginning, linked to the macro aspects of the economy. Of course, there are micro aspects, but the macro aspects are overwhelming. And if they are not set right, then I think we have a problem. And the challenge is coming both from the external and from the internal causes. So we need to appreciate what are the external causes and what are the internal causes which create a problem for employment generation. The first thing that is at issue in this is that there's multiplicity of data sources. So data is very confusing. There is CMIE, a private agency which gives data. The data comes from ILO, and the data comes from government's PLFS. And I think there are definitional issues between them, and that's why it gets very confusing. We have not had a census, but the projection is that in 2021, the population is 1.414 billion. And in 2025, it is 1.463.9 billion. So roughly 50 million increase in this period. But of course, that is net of the deaths. And the deaths estimated in 2025 are 13.12 million. So in other words, assuming that most of the deaths are in the age group below 5 or above 65, so in the working age group of 15 to 64, there'll be very few deaths. So in effect, there are 92.4 million additional people in the working age group between 2021 and 2025. So this is the kind of scenario that Santosh was pointing towards, that in 4 years, if there's additional 92.4 million in the working age group, then what we are talking about is some like 23 million, people who have to be provided for every year. This might continue, though of course the rate of population growth has been declining, but nonetheless it's somewhere in that ballpark figure. Now the CMI labor force March 2025 is 453.5 million, and the labor force participation rate in 2023, according to CMI, is around 40%. So it's rather low compared to other, equivalent countries. The government's PLFS data shows the labor force participation rate at 56.2% and the worker population ratio at 53.5%. And these are also low compared to the international figures for comparably large economies like US, Brazil, China, etc., where the labor force participation rate is anywhere from 65 to 70%. So whether it's CMIE or government PLFS, our labor force participation rate is much lower than other large economies. Now, regarding the macro, the point I want to make is that poverty and unemployment are not natural. Sometimes it's said that there is going to be poverty, there's going to be unemployment, and it's a part of the way it is. But my argument is that it's coming from the macroeconomic system and from the paradigm within which the economy is operating. If the paradigm changes, then policies change. And when policies change, then you can eliminate poverty and unemployment. So the point is that inadequate employment is what is resulting in growing conflict in society because the desirable jobs are few. So we see that even the well-off segments in Indian society, whether it be the Marathas or the Gujars or the Jats, they're also demanding reservation because their children face problem of getting good jobs. And the good jobs are the so-called good jobs in the organized sector, which, as Santosh has already mentioned, they are very small in number. Maybe 10% get jobs in the formal sector, 90% are dependent on the informal sector. This has adverse political and social consequences. So in India, the fight over reservations is increasing. And in the US, Trump's appeal to blue-collar workers is because the good jobs are not there in the USA. As President Trump kept saying, India, China, Mexico have stolen the jobs. So whether it be automobile sector, steel, aluminum, various other such intermediate technology goods jobs, they have gone away to these countries. And this is all a result of the macro, which is at fault as far as the employment generation is concerned. Now, I'll quote some figures from our report to give an idea of what the situation is. And partly Santosh has already mentioned from his work what it is. So for 2022, we estimated that unemployment is of 4 different kinds. So we have those who are unemployed. That means they are part of the labor force. They're looking for work and not getting the work. And that number was 29 million in 2022. Then there are the underemployed. People don't get 40 hours of work. They get maybe 36 hours, they get 24 hours or even less. So we estimated that about 25 million are underemployed. Then we have disguised unemployed. That's 26 million we estimated in agriculture, in trade and other sectors where people go, but they do not contribute to the productivity of the work. And then there are people who are outside the labor force. This is the large number. When we compared the labor force participation rate for 1991 with the present, we found that there should have been an additional 190 million people who should have been there if the labor force participation rate was similar to what it was in 1990-91. So in other words, what we estimated was that 332 million people have some kind of work, but 286 million don't have adequate work or have no work at all. If we, out of this, exclude the rural employment guarantee and those who are underemployed, we still need 225 million people who need some kind of work. And then we estimated that 24 million potential workers come in every year after doing 10th class, 12th class, undergraduate and graduate work. We estimated going back to 2000, 2002, 2005, and 2007, because those who are in 2007 would have completed 15 years and 10th class and come into the job market. Those who are in 2005 would have completed 12th class and come into the job market. So we estimated that about 27 million people would be coming into the age group where they would be wanting work. We excluded 25% would be women because they would not be able to work for social reasons. So the number came to 24 million for whom we have to provide. So the backlog of 225 million plus 24 million every year. So what we estimated was that we need in the next 5 years about 70 million work to be created if we are to cover the backlog plus provide for those who are potentially workers in the thing. Whereas the government, as Santosh pointed out, keeps talking about 5 to 8 million annually. That would be very small for what the problem is. The other thing that the government keeps saying is that growth will do the trick, that if we have high growth, then actually things would work. But the problem is that, as Santosh already mentioned, unemployment is acute in the rural areas, it's acute amongst the youth and amongst women. If these people have to create any jobs, they need capital, they need resources, but basically poor lack resources and therefore they cannot generate jobs for themselves. So this idea that growth will be able to solve the problem, the idea is that you grow the pie first, and people say don't distribute poverty. But the problem is that growth by itself will not be able to generate enough jobs because it also depends on the distribution in the economy and the technology that's used. So these macro features actually decide how much employment will be generated for a given amount of growth. What we have also shown in the report is that equitable growth will grow the pie as well as be more just because it will create more jobs. So what is the distribution? That becomes very important, and how technology is to be used. And I think Santosh was hinting about the MSME sector where the jobs have to be created. If 94% are in the unorganized sector and the unorganized sector is not doing well, then employment generation would be a problem. So I think distribution and technology are key features which determine how much employment will be generated for what kind of growth, but the present kind of growth we have is not going to do the trick. So what are the factors which underlie this growing unemployment? And we've listed in our report the various macro factors. The first is that since independence, we have gone for a top-down approach to development, and employment has been a residual. The investment has been targeted. So employment is whatever that investment generates. And if, as I was saying, technology is an issue, and if the investment is mostly in the organized sector, then the unorganized sector becomes a residual. So employment then becomes a residual in the system, and we don't necessarily generate good jobs. Inadequate provision of public goods like education and health are other reasons why we have inadequate employment generation, especially because education and health make the labor productive, as well as a lot of employment gets generated in these two sectors. So if these are buoyant, and I think Santosh has already hinted that our investment in education and health, our expenditure on these public expenditure, education and health as a share of GDP is very inadequate. It's very low as compared to most other countries. And even, in education compared to the Kothari Commission, which suggested that we should spend at least 6% of GDP on public education, we have never crossed 4% on that. And as Santosh mentioned, we have not crossed 1.3% on public health. So the very inadequate public investment in these. Then growing inequality is something which results in demand shortage and slowdown in the economy. And Santosh has already mentioned. So if the unorganized sector is not doing well and the organized sector is doing well, then the inequality between the two rises, and that leads to problems of shortage of demand. Then along with all this, at the macro level, the pro-business policies, what I call marketization policies, the technical change, and added to all this, the growing black economy in India. This growing black economy in India has a huge impact on development and on the efficacy of the public expenditures. These are other causes that result in the problem of inadequate employment generation. And then Santosh has already mentioned the shocks to the unorganized sector. Demonetization was the first shock in 2016, then GST, which is structurally wrong because it works against the micro sector and the small sector of the economy. So the GST has also led to decline of the unorganized sector. The third shock was the NBFC crisis of 2018. The small sector and demand from the lower segments depends on the NBFC. So NBFC crisis also added to the crisis of the unorganized sector. And then the sudden lockdown in 2020 because of the pandemic, that again damaged the unorganized sector. So all these four shocks, they have had an impact on our GDP estimation as well as on the unorganized sector and its demand. And that therefore creates a problem for employment generation. Now, employment also has gender dimension, caste dimension, community and regional dimension. So these also need to be addressed if we are to take care of the problem of unemployment. So basically what I'm arguing is that the policy paradigm since independence has been an issue. And that has actually led to a problem of employment generation in the economy. I remember even in the 1980s, there was a movement for right to employment because it was already felt in the 1980s that adequate employment generation is not taking place. There were several seminars that were organized by various people on this problem of employment generation. So employment generation as a problem has actually increased. And as I've been arguing, the top-down approach to our development has meant that our advanced sector has increased in size, but not increased in terms of the employment generation. So what has happened is that we have had pro-urban, pro-industry policies rather than pro-rural, pro-agriculture policies. And we've also used terms of trade to shift terms of trade against agriculture and rural areas so that we can extract surplus for urban areas industrialization. But it is this which has created crisis in agriculture and in rural areas where employment generation has been very inadequate. In addition to this, there has been the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank, and more so since 1991. These have come in the way of structuring our policies so as to be able to generate more employment and take care of the poor in the country. These policies have been pro-business, elite-centric, urban-centric, and pro-industry. That's why, you see, even the World Bank realized in the 1980s that its structural adjustment policies require a safety net. There was a book by Jolly and others in 1980s, in mid-80s, which talked about the safety net. And we in India also went in for safety nets from 2005 onward during the UPA 1 period, where we went in for midday meal schemes, for rural employment generation, for education and housing and various other such policies. But these are actually not a solution to the problem. They actually only are palliatives. In those countries where you need to provide safety net for 5 or 10% of the population, it's workable. But in India, where you require safety net for 70, 80% of the population, it will not deliver so well. This crisis has aggravated, and that's why now there's talk of the universal basic income since 2015. But universal basic income is against the principle of capitalism. As Kaletsky has pointed out, under capitalism, you pay for work done, you don't pay for work not done. Whereas UBI means you pay for work not done. So in other words, the crisis of capitalism has grown, and which is manifesting itself in the form that employment generation has been inadequate, whether in the US or in India. This problem has continued to grow because of the way the technology has changed in the world and why fewer jobs are getting created. Now I come to the aspect of black economy and the setback to development that it causes. Black economy is a result of the breakdown of consensus amongst rulers. So how the country is to be governed? People start generating through illegality incomes, and that becomes black income. And because of that, what I've shown that in India, we've been losing 5% growth rate since the mid-70s. If you add 5%, then the Indian economy today would be eight times larger than what it is. In other words, as compared to the potential of the economy, we are growing much less than what we could have grown. So if the economy was 8 times larger, the employment generation would have also been much higher than what it has been. The fact is that as a result of the black economy, resources are not available to the public sector for better education, health, employment generation, and so on. And also because associated with the black economy's flight of capital, this flight of capital means that investment is taking place abroad, but not in the Indian economy. So tax evasion reduces the availability of resources for the public sector to invest, and flight of capital reduces the availability of resources within the economy for increasing investment in the economy. As a result, the tax GDP ratio in India is low at 17.5%, whereas the black economy, which according to my estimate in the 2016 EPW article had reached 62%, our tax GDP ratio could have been 41%. This would have given us additional resources for employment generation, education, health, and various other things. It would have also given adequate resources for rural investment in the infrastructure and so on. And therefore, in a sense, what I've argued is that the black economy skews distribution in favor of the well-off segments. The inequality data that is coming on wealth and income is from the white economy. If you take the black economy into account, I've been arguing that the inequality in India is far greater than what it has been in South Africa or Brazil, which in white looks very high in those countries. But if you look at white plus black, then it's much higher in India than in those countries. So in other words, disparities and therefore shortage of demand are a result of the black economy. It's one of the key problems afflicting the Indian economy. Also, as Chidambaram pointed out in the budget of 2005, expenditures do not lead to outcomes. What it means is that you spend, but the outcomes are not there. So policy failure is very large in the Indian context. Now, I come down to the issue of technical change, because that, I think, is what is driving for the last 30 years, and which will actually drive much more strongly with the rising automation and the rising use of artificial intelligence. What has been happening is that technical change has been pushed into India because India has been trying to globalize. Now, when you have rapid technical change, as has been happening, as Arrow pointed out, it creates a mist of the future. The future is not clear where we are headed. So policymakers become short-termist, population also becomes short-termist. We don't take a long view of the problem. So in the Indian context, what has been happening is that even in agriculture, there's massive labor displacement. So for instance, we have more and more of tractors used, threshers, harvesters, and so on and so forth. So employment generation in agriculture has also been negligible post-2000. And modern industry, basically, that's where bulk of the investment is going, but that's not going to generate jobs due to automation. So inadequate employment generation is there in the rural areas and in industries. So the question is, where does labor go? And that's why our unorganized sector remains at 94%, because when you don't get a job in the organized sector, you're forced to be in the unorganized sector. So the lack of job creation in the organized sector, that's proving to be a problem. Now, with the coming of the AI, what has happened is that not only physical labor is getting displaced, but even mental labor. So in the coming years, you'll have call centers and BPOs disappearing, bots will be able to answer. And then you have the situation where doctors' jobs, lawyers' jobs, architect jobs, even they will start getting displaced as the AI becomes better and better. Already, I'm told ChatGPT 4.03 version is very good. And when ChatGPT 5 comes, it'll be even better. And it'll be self-correcting. And when it becomes self-correcting, it'll be able to displace a lot of the mental labor that's there. So in other words, the situation with technical change is going to get much worse for employment generation, because not only physical labor, but also mental labor is likely to be displaced very rapidly. Now, just stepping back a little, what I have argued in my work is that unorganized sector employing 94%, we don't really have data coming for the unorganized sector. So I've shown in my paper written earlier in 2019 that of the 39 subsectors of the unorganized sector, in 29 subsectors, we use the organized sector data to measure the size of the unorganized sector. So in other words, the organized sector, which is rising, is used to actually measure the declining unorganized sector. And therefore, we are biasing up our rate of growth. Now, if the 55% output in the organized sector can be said to be growing at 6 to 7%, but the unorganized sector growth is not that, if the unorganized sector growth was also 6 to 7%, massive amount of job creation would have been there. So my argument is that the 6 to 7% growth rate is only of the organized sector, not of the unorganized sector. If you measure it separately, like for instance, in the trade sector, the e-commerce is rising rapidly at 20-30%, whereas the neighborhood stores are declining. Similarly, reports are coming from the textile sector, from leather goods sector, luggage industry, pressure cooker industry, etc., FMCG, that actually is a decline in the unorganized sector. If you take that into account, then the rate of growth of the economy is not 6 to 7%, but closer to 1 to 2%. That's why I keep arguing that the Indian economy is not yet the fifth largest economy. It's still the ninth largest economy. And I've argued that the unorganized sector, as a result of these shocks, has been losing about 10 to 12 lakh crores of production every year since 2016. So in other words, the unorganized sector has been losing out very rapidly. So what has happened is that in data, we invisibilize the unorganized sector. And therefore, in policy also, we invisibilize it, because policymakers say that if the economy is doing at 6 to 7%, then the things are going well. We don't need to take separate steps. You can see this in the budget. In the budget, you can see that the sectors which represent the labor-intensive sectors, where the employment generation will be high, they are the ones which face cut. The moment the fiscal deficit rises, they are the ones that are cut, whereas the capital-intensive sectors are not cut. So I don't have the, I have a table which I could have shown how the cuts have been taking place as soon as the fiscal deficit rises. So anyway, since I can't show that table, let me give you the conclusions from the table. Announcements are made in the budget, but implementation does not take place because adequate allocation is not made to those schemes. Second is that heads concerning business are increased even if the deficit rises, whereas heads catering to the marginalized sections, they are reduced when the deficit begins to rise. So therefore, you can look at the capital expenditure in the budget also. Bulk of it is going for capital intensive sectors like big highways and big railway freight corridors, etc. Earlier, these used to be labor intensive. You could see thousands of people working, but now you see 10 people working with big cranes and big tractors and so on and so forth. So what has happened is that actually there is a philosophical change in society. We've all become homo economicus, and we are all looking for basically our own narrow economic interest. And that's why today equity and equality are not on the agenda of discussion in the country. Along with this change in perception that has taken place, there is a change in the education system. As the ASA reports point out, that the latest report pointed out that in the age group of 14 to 18, 40% children are not able to do second-class reading, writing, and maths. So these people will not be able to do a modern-day job. So there's a massive increase in frustration among the youth because A, there are not adequate jobs available for them, as Santosh pointed out, especially in the age group of 15 to 29. There's big unemployment. It's big amongst the women. So they don't have a prospect of getting a proper job even if they get a degree. So the degrees have got downgraded, and there is a huge frustration in them. As a result, the youth is open to irrationalities and dogmas, and also substance abuse has grown. As a result, violence has entered the family because these children doing substance abuse don't have money. So money snatching at home and violence at home, they have increased. So the question is, do we have the resources to be able to generate jobs? So even if we wanted to increase the rate of growth of the economy, the best way to do it would be to give additional jobs to those who don't find jobs. We will not be able to generate jobs in the organized sector because the organized sector is getting highly automated, and use of AI is actually going to decrease the amount of jobs that would be created there. So where do we generate jobs? We have to generate jobs in the micro sector and the small sector, and if possible, in agriculture. So agriculture incomes have to become more viable. The last survey of agriculture incomes was in 2017-18, which pointed to an average of 27 rupees per farmer per day, which is close to the poverty line. Similarly, in the unorganized sector, there is an e-Shram portal that has been set up. In the e-Shram portal, according to the Prime Minister, 300 million people have registered. And these 300 million, 90% show that their income is less than 10,000 rupees per month, which means they are also close to the poverty line. So we have to cater to the micro sector, the small sector, and to the agriculture sector. And in our report, we have suggested how this can be done. If we even get 50% of the black economy into the tax net, then our tax GDP ratio would rise from 17.5% to about 30%. And that would give enough resources to put into education, health, into the micro sector, and so on. It should also be recalled that of the MSME sector, 97.5% of the employment is in the micro sector. So micro sector are 60 million units, small and medium are 6 million units, and 0.6 million units, and the large units are only 6,000 units. So there's a factor of 100 between each. So we have to focus on the micro sector and the small sector and agriculture incomes if we are to generate a better distribution of income and more demand and raise the rate of growth of the economy. So in other words, the resources are not short. It is the policies where the problem is, the macro policies, which have resulted in massive inequality in the economy. Now, to conclude, employment generation is a macro and a long-term issue, whereas we have been dealing with it as a short-term and micro issue. There are social, political, economic, and environmental aspects related to the problem of unemployment in the economy. Production and incomes need to be restructured through alternative policies so as to make employment generation more robust. Technology and markets have to be introduced in a socially responsible manner so as not to generate more unemployment in the economy. The alternative that is being suggested will be opposed by several forces because businesses want cheap labor. So having unemployment enables them to get cheap labor. Also, the ruling elite, they want cheap labor so that they can have labor at home for the work. So in other words, there are going to be powerful forces which should oppose creation of full employment. But let me say full employment is a positive sum game. It will give benefit to everybody, including the organized sector, because demand for the organized sector would also rise. So in other words, to conclude, it's in our hands to be civilized and democratic. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Arun Kumar. Now we'll move over to the Q&A and discussion section. I've got 3 questions in on the chat box, and I encourage everybody to just use the chat box, and I'll put the questions to our speakers. We've had 2 fascinating broad scope presentations of this issue and related issues. And let me just go to the questions first. And one is from Sonal Sharma to Professor Santosh Mehrotra. Can you talk more about the policy shock during COVID? How could the government have acted differently without hampering the growth of the unorganized sector? And then there are 2 questions from Abhishek. There is one moment, please. There are 2 questions from Abhishek. Question for Professor Arun Kumar. You have talked about the data issue. Without accurate data, any kind of analysis is prone to error. What are your suggestions to improve data accuracy? And he's also asking for the link to your paper that you referred to. And the second question from Abhishek is, our agriculture procurement policy clearly favors the consumer. With tight price controls on wheat and rice, how do we expect agricultural income to increase? And from Jay Grewal, the question is that given that automation and AI are going to be dominant factors in the future, should one even think we will have jobs on the same scale as in the past, regardless of the policies? Of course, new jobs will be created, but in what numbers? Should the nation's focus be on wealth generation so that universal benefits, which should be mandatory, can be provided to the population? So, I mean, I'll stop there. And I'll throw the questions to, the first one was from Sonal Sharma was to Professor Mehrotra, and the others, Abhishek's first question was to Professor Kumar, and the other 2 seem to be open to both speakers. So please, Professor Mehrotra and Professor Kumar, if we could have your responses.
Right. COVID. There were serious design problems with one, the health response, and then the economic policy response. Let me deal with each in turn. On the health side, you will recall that on the 25th of March 2020, when there were barely 600 cases in the country, and all of those were in any case confined to 9 cities which had international airports, the whole country was forced into a national lockdown with railways stopped, all road transport stopped, all airlines stopped. Everything came to a standstill. Everyone was told to stay at home. 4 hours notice in a country of 1.4 billion people was brought down to a national lockdown. Problem number 1. South Africa also, just by way of contrast, South Africa also had a national lockdown. They gave 4 days notice in a country which is 1/20th our population and 1/10th our physical geographical size. Secondly, it was a national lockdown. There was no need for a national lockdown, as I think I've already indicated. China did not have a national lockdown. What China did in the early stages, and that was the following. It began in Wuhan. Wuhan is the capital of Hubei province. They stopped all transportation between Wuhan and Shanghai and Beijing, etc. But travel across the whole country was going on as normal. The Chinese economy did not contract. It actually still grew by 2% in that year, despite the supply side bottlenecks. Thirdly, our lockdown was the strictest in the world, the strictest by the Blavatnik School of Government, Oxford University metric, and it continued to be the strictest for the longest time. What was the reason for having the strictest lockdown in the first wave? In the second wave, finally the government realized in 2021, and in the second wave they decided, oh, let the state government do it. What does that mean? Then the central government had no role. So you can see from these that there was precious little planning. All the decisions were being taken in a centralized manner in the Prime Minister's office, and for 3 weeks after the lockdown was imposed, believe it or not, the state governments and the chief secretaries of the state governments were completely in the dark. Who's to be permitted to go? Who's not to be permitted? There was no protocol. There was no health protocol. And it was just unbelievable. This is on the health side, but only partially on the health side. We know perfectly well how poorly managed the health response itself was, because our health system is not geared for this. If you, over a 10-year period, don't manage, despite a national health policy announcement, we got a national health policy in January of 2017, which said that by 2024-25, which we are in now, our public expenditure to GDP, state and center together, will rise from the then level of 1.1% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP. China was spending 2.5% of GDP for decades at a much better level of health. And we wanted to go to 2.5, and we haven't still gone there. We are nowhere close to it, not even half that level. Speaks volumes for what the commitment of the government is to health. Let me now turn to the economic policy response. I've discussed these things in a paper in the Indian Economic Journal in 2021. There's a special issue devoted to that. So I'm only summarizing the findings from that paper, which I recall. If you compare India's fiscal stimulus and its monetary policy and credit stimulus with that of other emerging market economies, then please note that I'm talking about other emerging market economies. not comparing it with the phenomenal stimulus that was put in place by the rich countries. The other emerging market economies. What was the size of the fiscal stimulus of the other emerging market economies? 4.7% of GDP. What was ours? In the 2 years taken together, meaning FY21 and FY22 in COVID-1 and COVID-2 second wave, it was 3% to 3.1% of GDP. As low as that. Stingy. And let me tell you, I was in government in the Planning Commission when the global economic crisis took place. At the time of the global economic crisis, we put in place a fiscal stimulus alone of 3.5% of GDP, and the global economic crisis impact on India's economy was pathetic, relatively limited compared to the COVID crisis. Now let me turn to the monetary policy and the credit stimulus. Our credit stimulus was of the order of 6.9% of GDP. When EMEs, emerging market economies, credit and monetary policy stimulus was of the order of 1.9% of GDP. So why was ours 4 times, 3 times as large? The results were, future wholesale price inflation and inflationary tendencies which set in motion, which have not gone away today. So the point is to badly design both the health response as well as the economic policy response. Let me stop there. I'll come back to the AI issue after Arun has spoken.
Okay, the first question is about data issues and errors and how can policy be made. Policy will have errors if we have data errors. So the unorganized sector, which as I said, is marginalized in data and therefore also in policy. Let me give a concrete example. As I was saying, that there are 60 million micro units and they are suffering because of the kind of policy that we are pursuing. The small sector, which is about 6 lakh units, they are also suffering because they don't get input credit. GST leads to input credit for the large scale and the medium sector, but not for the small sector. Therefore, the cost of production for the small and the micro sector has not declined, but that for the organized sector, for the large and the medium, that has declined. And therefore, actually, demand has shifted from the unorganized to the organized sector. And therefore, the organized sector has been growing, but not the unorganized sector. And that's why you see the split in the Indian economy. That's why you see the stock market rising, because the stock market reflects the health of the organized sector, not the unorganized sector. Similarly, the tax data, the direct tax GDP ratio going up, and the GST collection going up, that also is coming from the organized sector. The unorganized sector is not in the direct tax net or in the GST net. So the data that we are using is actually the organized sector data, and we're planning for the economy using the organized sector data. So that's why I keep saying that the organized sector has colonized the unorganized sector. So the errors in our data and in our policies are pretty large, and therefore our policies will not succeed in doing what is the right thing to do as far as employment generation is concerned. The link to the paper, this is actually partly given, the summary of it is given in the mainstream in November 2022. If you like, you can take a look at the summary. On the employment generation annually, I wrote a piece in the Hindu that came out in 2023. You can look at that paper in 2023. Regarding agriculture, you're right that these policies are designed to keep agriculture prices low. We have 23 crops for which the minimum support price or the support price is declared, but it is implemented basically in 3 crops, not in the 23. So what has happened is that production has been biased in favor of these 3 crops: the paddy, wheat, and sugarcane. Therefore, you have large stocks of, but you have shortage of other commodities like oil seeds and dals and so on. So you have to import them. Also, environmentally, it's damaging because you're growing paddy in Punjab, you're growing sugarcane in Maharashtra, where in Maharashtra there's a water shortage. So therefore, the water table is sinking. And so you have environmental damage. So in other words, if you have minimum support price for all crops, then this kind of bias in favor of these 3 crops would go away. Your foreign exchange saving would be there, And also what will happen is that your food stocks will be much less than what they are at the moment. And therefore, with a given amount of subsidy that is being given at the moment in food, you will actually be able to do better. And the farmers will have higher incomes. If farmers have higher incomes, then the demand will increase, and demand for organized sector will also increase. And therefore, the economy as a whole will do much better. Automation and artificial intelligence, that was another question. Where will the jobs come from? And that's going to be a huge challenge. We have not been able to provide jobs with the, we have not been able to provide jobs with the kind of technical change that has been taking place. For instance, I'll give you an example. I was talking to somebody in Maruti, and they told me that 10 years back, one car used to come out every 58 seconds, and on each car, there'll be 10 robots and 10 people working. Now there are 20 robots and 5 people working, and one car is coming out in 38 seconds. Similarly, in Tata Steel, you had 2 million production in 1990-91 and 88,000 people working. In 2015, the production in Tata Steel was 15 million tons and only about 30,000 people working. You see that in the banking sector, where, in 1990-91, everything you needed to go inside a bank branch to do the work, whether to withdraw cash, to get your checkbook, to get your passbook filled up. Now everything can be done on the mobile phone. So the work of banks has increased by maybe 1,000-fold, but the workforce there has become half. So in other words, this kind of technical change that has been taking place, organized sector is not generating jobs, and that's why the organized sector employment was 6% in 1990 and remains about 6% now. That's the formal sector employment in the organized sector. So in other words, unless we give precedence to the micro sector, to the small sector, and to agriculture, if we, as Santosh rightly pointed out, we need specific policies on industrialization, especially to boost the micro sector and the small sector. We also need policies to boost incomes in agriculture so the micro sector sustains. The demand from each other, from the micro sector and from the agriculture sector, will sustain each other. And therefore, in a sense, that's the route to go. But I've also argued that with AI now, actually, the unemployment will rise dramatically in those sectors like doctors, lawyers, etc., chartered accountants, because their work will get displaced. I know of one app which just takes a picture of your forehead, and it can tell you what your BP is and what your sugar level is, etc. Okay, and there are another app I know which takes a picture of your skin and tells you what's the problem in your skin. So large number of things are coming up which will actually displace doctors and lawyers and so on and so forth also. So what needs to be done is we have to introduce, as I said, technology in a socially responsible manner. If productivity rises, then the number of working hours in the week have to be cut so that everybody gets employment. Without that, there is no solution. So there will be a problem as technology changes, and we need to have a socially responsible way of dealing with this rising productivity.
Yeah, Professor Mehrotra?
Yeah, let me come in on this Industrial Revolution 4 technologies, broadly speaking, and where India stands in this regard. Broadly, I'm in agreement with Arun, but there are some dimensions that our listeners should actually also take into account. I would say many good things have indeed happened in the last 5 or 6 years. In 2016, there were only about 1,000 startups in India. Today, there are 150,000 startups. The CAGR of the growth in startups is in the region of 20%. It may, at that rate, if it continues, will go to 1 million startups by 2035. The space in which the startups have grown and have indeed created new jobs, and I want to tell our young listeners particularly that most IIT and NIT engineers today, they don't want to get into jobs. They are all creating startups. Those startups are in the ed tech space, fintech space, health tech space. Arun just talked about it. food tech, and many other. There are also, unlike what people might think and unlike what our industry minister seems to believe, they're all just, supplying food to homes. There's also 4,500 of the 150,000 startups today, which are in the space of deep tech. No small number, 4,500. They need support. Now, from the government, they certainly are getting much more domestic venture capital coming in there, and a certain amount of sort of job creation in the organized sector is taking place as a result of this. This has been enabled precisely by what has emerged in the last 8 to 10 years, well, which has emerged in the last 15 years, is the digital public infrastructure that our country has actually managed to take to scale. We all have a biometric identification. Pretty much most of the population, unlike in the vast majority of emerging market economies, have a bank account. I'll come back to that in a second, because the question was raised about universal benefits. And all of this is what is enabling account aggregators to come up across the country. And if the number of startups grows at the rate at which it is anticipated, and if there is support from venture capital as well as the government for deep tech, then there is perhaps hope here. Let me, in the interest of brevity, just mention that, it is true that organized sector jobs are growing much more slowly, and this is a source of worry. But this has to be nuanced by what I've just been saying. It is absolutely true that, robotics, Tata Steel, banking, all the examples that Arun gave are absolutely spot on. The important point is that across the globe, robotics and automation is actually confined to two sectors, by and large. One is automobile manufacturing, the other is electrical and electronic appliances. Automation, and robotics is not gone across all types of industries. So yes, there are risks associated with it. And let me just close by making two quick points. There have been 3 previous industrial revolutions. It is true that this one is many ways different. We don't have the time to go into those reasons for the difference. But in all previous industrial revolutions, the number of jobs, a large number of jobs were destroyed, but a large number of new jobs were also created. And the number of jobs that were created were larger than the number of jobs that were destroyed. If that had not happened over a 200-year period history or 250-year period history of the 4 industrial revolutions, populations would not have continued to grow. My last point is the following. With such a high proportion of our workforce still informal, and because our dividend is running out, and because we are becoming an aging society, I have been writing about this for the last 10 years, that there is a roadmap, an architecture, a blueprint for actually putting in place a social insurance mechanism, a social security mechanism to ensure that as the nature of work changes, as the future of work changes, the employer-employee relationship will weaken as disappearing. We have to ensure that social security is still ensured. There is a mechanism for doing it. If you're interested, you can read a paper by me in the Journal of Asia Political Economy, Journal of Asia Pacific Economies. It's also available on the website of the University of Warwick Center for Development Studies. Point is, this can be done, and it has to be done because our dividend is running out. Yeah. Back to you, Dr. Sridharan.
Thank you so much. I mean, we have run out of time. We slightly overstepped time, but we had 2 very rich presentations. And despite the technical glitches, in fact, we probably covered more ground then if you had been showing slides, and that means stopping to let the audience absorb the graphs and tables. So actually, perhaps you covered more ground, giving us the key facts and figures, key trends. Thank you, Professor Santosh Mehrotra and Professor Arun Kumar, so much for your detailed presentation on this topic and for all aspects of it. And let me thank all the audience who made time in this evening or your morning or midday or wherever you are to attend this webinar. And lastly, thank UPIASI staff, Aparna, Pasumarthi, Jacqueline Massey, and Tisha Sethi for organizing this. And so with that, I wish you a good evening, rest of the evening, or good day ahead of you. So thank you all very much. Yes.
Thanks for organizing it.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just quickly say hello to Professor Jerry Behrman at the University of Pennsylvania, who I haven't seen for the longest time.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Yeah.
I think I'm just going to end the call now.
Yeah. Yes.